The gun was already in her hand when Simon Trask walked through the door of the Dust Creek Sheriff's office, and the look on Beatrice Rhodes's face was not the look of a woman who needed saving. It was the look of a woman who had already decided she did not. "Get out," she said. Her voice was flat and hard as the desert floor outside, worn smooth by years of weight. The Colt revolver did not waver. Her hand was steady in a way that told him this was not the first time she had pointed a weapon at a man and meant it. "Whatever you came here to sell, I am not buying. Whatever story you rehearsed on the ride over, you can take it back to whoever sent you." Simon Trask did not move. He stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and the late afternoon sun burning orange at his back, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he recognizes even when he has never seen it before. "I did not come here to sell anything," he said. "Then you came here to take something." She stepped out from behind the desk, keeping the barrel level with the center of his chest. "Men always come here to take something. Land rights, water rights, my badge. My testimony against a man they'd rather see walking free." Her jaw tightened. "So which is it?" "None of those things." He kept his voice even, low, the kind of voice you use around a horse that has been spooked badly and is deciding whether to bolt or kick. "I came because your deputy rode out to the Callaway Ranch this morning and told my foreman that Sheriff Rhodes had been shot." Beatrice went very still. The revolver did not drop, but something shifted behind her eyes, something that flashed through fast like heat lightning over a summer ridge, there and gone before you could name it. Fear, maybe, or the ghost of it. Because she had been shot 3 days ago. The wound was under her left arm, bound in strips torn from her own underskirt because she had not sent for a doctor, had not told a soul, had dragged herself back to the office and locked the door from the inside and breathed through the pain alone in the dark the way she had been doing everything for the last 6 years. And someone had told. "Who sent you?" she said. It was not a question anymore. "Nobody sent me." He set his hat down on the chair just inside the door, slow and deliberate, so she could track the movement and not be startled. "My name is Simon Trask. I run the Callaway spread, and I am the only doctor this side of the Cimarron River." She stared at him. And for one terrible, exposed second, Beatrice Rhodes did not know what to do with that. It had been 6 years since the death of her husband, Thomas Rhodes, former sheriff of Dust Creek, New Mexico Territory. 6 years since she had taken his badge off his chest herself, pinned it to her own, and told the town council that she would serve out the remaining term of his appointment and they could argue about it afterward. They had argued. She had ignored them. She had served 2 terms since, been elected both times, and had not once asked anyone for a single thing. She had not let anyone take care of her in years. And now this man, this quiet stranger with dust on his boots and something careful in his eyes, was looking at her wound like it was a problem he intended to solve. She almost told him to leave again. She almost said the word. It was right there, loaded and ready, same as the revolver. She was good at refusal. She had built her whole life into a fortress of it. But the wound had been bleeding again since that morning. She could feel the seep of it against her ribs, slow and insistent, and the fever that she had been ignoring for 2 days was no longer something she could name as tiredness alone. She lowered the gun. Just a fraction. Just enough. "You better be what you say you are," she said. "Yes, ma'am," said Simon Trask, and he picked up the worn leather bag that had been sitting outside the door the whole time, the one she had not noticed because she had been so focused on his hands, and he stepped inside and closed the door quietly behind him. Quietly. That was the word for it, she would think later. Everything he did was quiet, not weak, not small. But quiet in the way of deep water, the kind that does not announce itself and does not need to. She almost missed it every single time. The year was 1878, and the town of Dust Creek, New Mexico Territory, was the kind of place that accumulated hard people, the way riverbanks accumulated silt. It sat at the base of a long red mesa in the middle of the driest stretch of land between the Rio Grande and the Colorado. And it survived, because it sat at the crossroads of two cattle drives and had both water and a telegraph line, which in 1878 made it valuable enough to fight over and mean enough to produce the kind of sheriff it needed. Beatrice had arrived in Dusk Creek, 22 years old and newly married, following Thomas Rhodes west from Missouri with a trunk of practical clothing and a head full of practical sense. She had not been a naive woman, even then. She had grown up in a household where her father drank away his paycheck every Friday, and her mother kept the family alive through sheer stubborn ingenuity, and she had learned early that the world did not arrange itself into kindness without help. Thomas had been a good man. She wanted to be clear about that in her own heart, in the accounting she kept of things. He had been patient and funny and genuinely decent, and he had never once tried to diminish her, which she understood by then was rarer than it should have been. He had taught her to shoot and had meant it as a gift, not a performance, and when he began to suspect that his deputy Clarence Webb was running a protection racket through the cattle pens on the south end of town, he had told Beatrice everything because he trusted her judgment. That trust had gotten him killed. Webb had shot Thomas on a Wednesday evening in October of 1872 and had arranged it to look like a robbery. He had done a decent job of it. He had also underestimated the fact that Beatrice Rhodes had been present in that office every night her husband worked late, and she had seen things, and she had kept meticulous notes in a journal that Webb did not know existed. She had taken the badge and she had built the case, and she had stood in front of a territorial judge in Santa Fe and delivered 6 months of evidence so thorough and so cold that Clarence Webb had been convicted and hanged within the year, and Beatrice had come back to Dusk Creek, unpinned the badge, set it on the desk, and then picked it up again because she did not know what else she was. 6 years. She had run the office. She had kept the peace. She had done it alone, because the deputies she hired tended to be men who resented taking orders from a woman, and the one who had not resented it, a young man named Hector Fuentes, had left the previous spring to get married in Albuquerque, and she had sent him off with her blessing and a bone-deep tiredness that she did not examine too closely. She was 34 years old. She was the law in Dusk Creek. She had been shot in the side 3 days ago by a cattle rustler named Dale Prout, who she had then tracked for 12 miles and arrested before she would let herself fall off her horse, and she had been bleeding quietly ever since. This was the woman that Simon Trask walked in on. He cleaned the wound at the desk because the light was better there. He worked without commentary, without the performance of reassurance that she had always hated, the there it will be fine that men offered when what they really meant was please, don't be upset in front of me. He had steady hands and he knew what he was doing, and the only time he spoke was to say, quietly, "This is going to hurt for a moment," before he irrigated the channel of the wound with carbolic solution, and it did hurt. It hurt considerably, but she did not make a sound and he did not seem to expect her to. When he was done binding it with proper linen, he sat back and looked at her with the measuring expression of a professional. "The ball went through clean," he said. "No bone involved. You need to rest it for a week or you risk tearing the muscle and prolonging the healing by a month. You also have a low fever that you need to watch. If it climbs, send for me immediately." "You live on the Callaway spread," she said. "I do. I took the position of ranch foreman 2 years ago. Before that I was practicing medicine in Amarillo." "Why did you stop?" He was quiet for a moment. He picked up the cloth he had used to clean the wound and folded it with precise, unhurried movements. "That is a longer story than you probably want from a man you just met at gunpoint," he said. It was the right answer. It acknowledged the question without deflecting it entirely, and it recognized that she had rights to the information without claiming she was owed it immediately. She filed it away, the way she filed everything. "How did my deputy know I had been shot?" she said. "I don't believe it was your deputy who figured it out." He reached into the leather bag and produced a small brown bottle. "Your horse came back to the livery last night with blood on the saddle. The livery keeper, a man named Ortega, told the deputy. The deputy apparently told half the town this morning. Beatrice closed her eyes briefly. Wonderful, she said. The faintest thing happened at the corner of Simon Trask's mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was something quieter than a smile, more private, like a thought that had gotten loose. The town appears to have a significant investment in your continued existence, he said. The town appears to have a significant investment in my business, she said. He stood and collected his bag. The light had shifted while he worked, dropping from orange to the deep bruised purple of a desert evening, and the office had grown dim around them. He crossed to the door and then stopped and turned back. "There is one other thing," he said. He said it carefully, which made her look at him sharply. "What?" "Dale Prout, the man who shot you." He met her eyes. "He has a brother, younger, name of Colt Prout. He rode into town this afternoon, an hour before I arrived. I passed him on the main road. He was asking questions about the sheriff at the saloon." The fever was making the edges of things soft, but her mind sharpened right through it. "Thank you," she said. "I will handle it." "I have no doubt of that," Simon Trask said, and he left. She sat in the dimming office and listened to the sound of his horse leaving, and she put her hand over the clean white binding under her shirt, and she thought about the fact that she had not let anyone near her wound for 3 days, and she had let him near it inside of 10 minutes. She did not examine that too closely either. Colt Prout was 26 years old and had his brother's face and none of his brother's patience, which made him more dangerous in some ways and less in others. He was the kind of man whose anger ran right at the surface, hot and visible, which meant he was predictable but also meant he did not calculate risk the way smarter men did. He had ridden from Tucson in 4 days when he got the news of Dale's arrest, and he had arrived in Dust Creek with a gun on each hip and a story about how his brother had been wrongfully accused. Beatrice knew all of this by 7 in the morning the following day, because she had informants, because she was thorough, and because the bartender at the Red Horse Saloon had been reporting useful information to her office in exchange for her periodic overlooking of his unlicensed gambling operations for 3 years running. She did not go out to confront Prout. Not that morning. The wound was tight and painful, and she was operating with the particular careful economy of a person who knows they cannot afford to spend energy recklessly, and she needed to know more about what he intended before she moved. What she did not expect was Simon Trask to appear at her office door at 8 in the morning with a wrapped parcel of food. She looked at the parcel. She looked at him. She looked at the parcel again. "I have a cook at the ranch," he said. "She makes enough food for 12 people every morning out of habit because there used to be 12 people. She wrapped this up and told me to bring it." He set it on the desk. "I am just the delivery man." Beatrice did not touch it. "I did not ask for food." "No," he agreed. "You did not." He sat down in the chair across from her desk, the chair where witnesses sat and occasionally defendants, and he looked at her without apology or explanation, just a quiet, settled attention that reminded her suddenly and unexpectedly of her mother's garden, of all things, the way it had always been there in the morning when you opened the back door. "What are you doing?" she said. "Sitting down," he said, "if that is permissible." "You rode 4 miles from the Callaway spread to deliver food and sit in my office." "I rode 4 miles to check on my patient," he said. "The food was incidental." She pulled the parcel toward her. Inside were biscuits and a jar of honey and a cloth-wrapped piece of salt pork that was still warm. She realized, extremely hungry because she had not eaten properly in 3 days, because she had been managing the wound and the fever and the Prout situation, and she had forgotten, the way she always forgot, that the body had requirements that did not defer to the urgency of other things. She ate. She did not thank him effusively. She ate the way she did everything, with focused efficiency, and he did not make a production of watching her, just sat with a natural ease and looked out the window at the main street waking up. "Tell me about Amarillo," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wagon clattered past. "I had a practice there for 4 years, general medicine with some surgery. I came from Ohio originally. Studied at the Western Reserve University." He paused. My partner in the practice had a gambling problem that I did not know about until the bank came to collect a debt he had taken out in both our names. By the time it was resolved, the practice was gone and I had very little left. A friend offered me work on the Callaway spread and I took it. Beatrice looked at him. A doctor working as a ranch foreman. The cattle don't ask me complicated questions, he said, and that thing happened at the corner of his mouth again. How old are you? She said. 37, she nodded once. She returned to the biscuits. There is a wanted notice on Colt Pruitt from the Arizona Territory, she said. Assault. He beat a man badly enough to put him in a hospital in Tucson. The man lived, so the charge was not murder, but the warrant is active. She paused. I intend to arrest him today if he makes any move toward this office or toward the jail where his brother is being held. I need you to understand that, in case you were planning to recommend I rest. I was planning to recommend you rest, Simon Trask said. I recognize it will not change anything. It will not. Then I recommend instead that you eat the rest of that salt pork and drink the water in your canteen, which I notice is half empty, which means you have been forgetting to drink as well. He reached into his coat and produced a small glass bottle. And take 12 drops of this in the water. Willow bark tincture. It will bring the fever down and take enough of the edge off the pain that you can move without compensating for it. When you compensate for pain in your posture, you telegraph it to anyone watching. She stared at him. That is an extremely practical observation, she said. I am an extremely practical man, said Simon Trask. She took the bottle. He left after that, after checking the wound briefly and declaring the fever marginally lower, and telling her again to send word if it climbed, and she watched him ride out with a feeling she could not immediately categorize. It was not discomfort. It was something adjacent to discomfort but softer at the edges, the way a bruise is once it has started to heal, present but no longer sharp. She arrested Colt Pruitt at 2 in the afternoon, when he walked to the jail door with a gun already half drawn, announcing his intention to break his brother out or put a bullet in the woman pretending to be law in this town. She came around the side of the building where he was not expecting her and disarmed him with a speed that came from 6 years of practice and the muscle memory of a woman who had learned that hesitation was a luxury she could not afford. He tried to grab her, and she put her elbow into his nose with enough force to drop him, and the pain in her side went white and enormous, and she breathed through it the way she breathed through everything and got his wrists into irons and dragged him inside. It cost her. She sat at her desk afterward and felt the wound pulling in a way that told her she had torn something small, and she pressed her hand against it and breathed until the world stopped tilting. The willow bark tincture helped. She was not going to tell him that. She told him 3 days later when he came back, this time not with food but with a new medical book he had ordered from a catalog in Denver, something he mentioned only in passing and not as a gift to her specifically but as a general acquisition, and he asked after the wound and she let him look at it and she said, "The tincture was useful." He nodded as though this were ordinary information. "I will leave you another bottle," he said. It was not a dramatic moment. It was not the kind of moment that songs were written about. But Beatrice Rhodes, sitting in the chair in her own office while a man looked after a wound she had been ignoring for a week, felt something in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. Something that was not gratitude exactly, because gratitude implied a transaction, and this did not feel like a transaction. It felt like something being set down very gently by someone who understood that it was heavy. She almost missed it. She almost filed it under medicine and practicality and moved on. But it stayed. The feeling stayed, quiet and persistent, like the man himself. October moved into November, and the Pruitt situation resolved itself when a U.S. Marshal arrived from Santa Fe with papers for both brothers, which took Dale Pruitt out of Beatrice's jurisdiction entirely and deposited Colt in a federal holding cell. And Beatrice spent 2 days writing reports and then stood in her empty, quiet office and felt something that took her a full hour to identify as relief. Not because the danger was gone. She was used to danger. The relief was simpler and stranger than that. It was the relief of having gotten through something without having to do it entirely alone, even if the help had been quiet and peripheral and unannounced. Simon Trask came by the following Friday. He came on Friday mornings with some regularity now, and she had stopped asking why, partly because his answers were always practical and unarguable, and partly because she had started, without fully deciding to, looking toward the window at around 7:30 on Friday mornings. This Friday he brought a letter that had been misdelivered to the Callaway Ranch. "This is from the territorial government," she said, looking at the seal. "It arrived at our ranch 2 weeks ago. My foreman, the previous one, apparently had the same address number on the same road before the town put up new signs." She opened it and read it and set it down on the desk. "They want to appoint a new sheriff," she said. Her voice was even. "They are saying that the position should be held by an elected official under the new county structure. There will be a vote in March." Simon sat in the chair across from her. He was quiet for a moment. "You could run," he said. "I have been the sheriff for 6 years without anyone's vote." "Which means you have 6 years of record," he said. "Most candidates have speeches and promises. You have 6 years of evidence." She looked at him. He was not trying to rally her, she realized. He was not performing encouragement. He was simply presenting the arithmetic of the situation the way he always presented things, with a dry, practical clarity that she had come to recognize as his specific form of respect. He did not soften things for her. He did not inflate them either. He just looked at the facts and said what he saw. She had forgotten that people could do that. "Tell me something," she said, "and I am asking plainly, so please answer plainly." "All right," he said. "Why do you keep coming here?" He was quiet for a long moment, not evasive, just genuinely considering the question with the same care he gave everything. "Because you are the most interesting person within 40 miles, he said. "And because I believe that interesting people are worth the effort of showing up for." A pause. "And because you have not once told me to stop, which in my observation is the closest you come to an invitation." Beatrice was quiet. Outside, the wind had come up, the dry desert November wind that carried dust and the smell of juniper, and it moved through the crack under the door and stirred the papers on her desk. "That is an accurate observation," she said finally. Something shifted in the quality of the silence between them, not dramatically. There were no declarations, no reaching across the desk. Just a mutual acknowledgement, as quiet and precise as everything else between them, that something was present that had not been named yet and that did not need to be rushed. "Your wound," he said, returning to the immediate and practical with what she was beginning to understand was characteristic grace. "How is it healing?" "Well," she said, "I can lift my left arm fully now. Any recurrence of fever?" "No." "Good." He settled back in the chair. "Tell me about the election." And she did. She talked through the politics of Dust Creek the way she talked through every operational problem, methodically and without flourish. And he listened the way he always listened, with full attention, asking questions at the right moments. And by the end of it, she had a clearer picture of her own situation than she had had when she started talking, which was another thing she had forgotten that another person could do for you. She ran for sheriff. The campaign was not the kind of thing that anyone in Dust Creek, New Mexico territory in 1878 would have recognized as a campaign in any modern sense. There were no posters. There were no rallies. There was Beatrice Rhodes, going about her work with the same unbroken efficiency she had always employed. And there were her 6 years of record, which people knew because they had lived inside them. And there were 3 other men running for the position, none of whom had done anything more substantial in Dust Creek than own land and pay their taxes. There was also a concerted effort by a man named Gerald Ash. Ash was 48 years old, and he owned the largest cattle operation in the county and the only bank. And he had wanted Dust Creek under his thumb since before Thomas Rhodes had been sheriff. He had managed it tolerably well when the deputies he hired managed to run their own small operations under the protection of official indifference, But Beatrice had cleared out that arrangement thoroughly, and Ash had been grinding his teeth about it for 6 years. He began by spreading stories. Nothing actionable, nothing direct. The kind of whisper campaign that traveled through saloons and barbershops and Sunday services. The kind that said things like, "It is unusual, is it not?" And "A woman in that office. Well, and I heard that the Rhodes woman let those Prout boys go without a proper hearing." None of it was true. All of it was targeted. Beatrice heard about it within 48 hours, because she had informants, because she was thorough, and because the bartender at the Red Horse Saloon had not retired from his information-gathering activities. She went to see Gerald Ash. She went in the morning, before his office was properly open, and she knocked on the door and went in and sat down across from him and put her hands on the desk and said, in a voice that was entirely level and carried no heat at all, "I know what you are doing, Mr. Ash, and I know why you are doing it. And I want you to understand that I have documentation of every arrangement your affiliated deputies ran through the cattle pens in 1874 and 1875. I kept the records. I always keep the records. You may choose to continue what you are doing, in which case I will present that documentation to the territorial prosecutor in Santa Fe, or you may choose to stop, in which case we will have no further conversation about it. What would you like to do?" Gerald Ash looked at her for a long time. "You are a formidable woman, Sheriff Rhodes," he said. "I am aware," said Beatrice, and she stood up and left. The whisper campaign stopped. She told Simon about it that Friday, not because she needed to debrief it, but because she had found, without meaning to, that her Fridays were structured around the conversation. He listened and then said, "You walked in there alone. I always work alone." "I know," he looked at her steadily. "I am not criticizing it, I am noting it. What is the difference? A criticism says you did something wrong. A notation says I noticed something about you." He paused. "I notice a great many things about you." There it was again, that shift in the air between them, that quiet warmth that had been building for months without either of them reaching for it directly. She was more comfortable with it now. She had stopped startling away from it the way she had in the beginning, when anything warm had felt like a threat, a vulnerability, a gap in the wall. "You notice too many things," she said. "Probably," he agreed. "It is a professional hazard." She almost smiled. She caught it just before it fully formed, pressed her lips together and looked down at the papers on her desk, and when she looked up again, Simon Trask was watching her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Tender was the word. It was such an unexpected word to apply to the sharp, quiet lines of his face that it took her a moment to settle on it. Tender. She cleared her throat. "The election is in 3 weeks, she said. "Yes," he said, "it is." That evening after he had gone, she stood in the office with her hands braced on the window frame, looking out at the main street of Dusk Creek in the dark, and she tried to make a fair accounting of what was happening inside her. She had been doing this, the internal accounting, for 6 years. It was how she managed things. You named them precisely and you decided what to do with them. What she found when she looked honestly was this: she was afraid. Not of Ash, not of the election. She was afraid of Simon Trask, and the quiet, unhurried way he had walked into the gap she had kept so carefully empty and simply started occupying it. Not loudly, not dramatically, not with any demand that she acknowledge him, just with his steady presence and his careful hands and his particular, attentive way of looking at her, as though she were worth the trouble of being accurately seen. She was afraid because she had been hurt before, not by Thomas. Thomas had not hurt her, but by the years after him, by the accumulated weight of being the woman in the wrong job in the wrong time, fighting for the wrong things according to everyone who wanted her to sit down. And she had built her walls high, and she had built them well, and she had been comfortable inside them, in the way that safe things are comfortable even when they are also lonely. And she was afraid because she wanted to let him in, and she did not know if she still knew how to do that without the walls coming down entirely, and she did not know if she could survive that. She stood there for a long time. Then she went to bed, because it was late and the wound was still healing and she had a county to run in the morning. The election was held on the first Tuesday of March 1879 in the town hall, which was the largest building in Dust Creek and doubled as the courthouse and the community meeting space, and on one memorable occasion, a hospital when the influenza swept through in 1876. Beatrice had been in this room for all of those things. She sat in the back and watched the ballot boxes fill, and she did not allow herself to perform any particular feeling about it. Simon was there. He sat 2 rows ahead of her and did not look at her more than once briefly, with a nod that meant nothing anyone could point to and that meant everything to her, which she recognized as a significant piece of data. The count took until evening. She won by 41 votes. The town council chairman, a dry and decent man named Hartwell, read the results from the front of the room, and there was a sound from the assembled Dust Creek residents that was not quite applause and not quite a cheer, more of a collective exhaling, the sound of something being decided that most of them had already known. Beatrice accepted the official paperwork and shook Hartwell's hand and went back to her office and stood in the middle of it in the dark, her newly formal badge in her hand. There was a knock at the door. Simon Trask came in with a bottle of wine, which was such an unexpected departure from his usual patterns that she actually laughed. It came out of her like a surprise, genuine and unguarded, and the sound of it seemed to startle both of them. "I did not know you were capable of doing that," he said, meaning the laugh. "I am capable of a great number of things you have not seen," she said, and then realized how that sounded and felt warmth climb up the back of her neck. He uncorked the wine with the small knife he always carried and poured 2 measures into the tin cups from her shelf and handed her one, and she took it and they stood in her dark office with the lamplight making shadows and the sound of Dust Creek celebrating outside, and they drank the wine without a toast because neither of them was the kind of person who made speeches. "Beatrice," he said. He used her name. He almost never used her name, she realized. He called her nothing, or occasionally sheriff, with a dry quality that was as close to humor as he got in professional settings. Hearing her name in his voice was different. It landed differently. "Yes," she said. "I want to say something and I want to say it plainly because I believe you prefer plainness." "I do." He looked at her across the small distance of the office, the 2 tin cups and the lamplight and the 6 months of Friday mornings and willowbark tincture and quiet company between them. "I am not a man who makes declarations easily," he said. "I am not built for grand gestures. I have no talent for the kind of courtship that announces itself. But I find that I have spent the last 6 months finding reasons to be in this office, and I think you are aware of that, and I think you are aware that the reasons have very little to do with medicine." She looked at him. "I am aware," she said. Echoing her own words from Ash's office deliberately. "I would like," he said very carefully, "to continue finding reasons, if you are amenable to that." "Continue finding reasons," she said. "That is your declaration." "That is my declaration," he said. She looked at him for a long moment, this quiet and careful man who had walked through her door with his hat in his hands and his medical bag outside, and had never once tried to fix her or save her or diminish her, who had simply shown up, again and again, with food and tinctures and conversations and his particular quality of attention that made her feel, for the first time in years, that being seen was not the same thing as being exposed. "I am amenable to that," she said. The almost smile happened on his face again, and this time she let her own answer it, and for a moment in the lamplit office they just looked at each other, and it was the most uncomplicated she had felt since she was 22 years old and newly arrived in the West with a trunk of practical clothing and a head full of practical sense. Spring came to Dust Creek the way spring always came to the high desert, not gently but abruptly, the cold cracking open one morning to reveal a day so blue and warm that it felt like an entirely different country. The wildflowers came up along the base of the red mesa, and the cattle spread out across the grazing land and the birds came back, and Simon Trask continued to come on Friday mornings. The difference now was that sometimes he stayed past noon. They were not dramatic, their time together. They did not perform courtship for anyone, did not promenade down the main street or sit together at the church social where half the town would have watched them over the tops of their hymnals. What they did was sit in her office and drink coffee and talk about the territorial politics and the cattle drives and the books he ordered from the catalog in Denver, about Ohio and Missouri, and the particular quality of loneliness that came with both of them being people who had built their lives without a net, about the practical matters of his ranch work and her casework, and the complicated living experiment of being themselves in the world. She told him about Thomas. She had not talked about Thomas to anyone in a very long time. She told him about the Wednesday in October, about the badge and the journal and the case she had built over 6 months of grief and fury, and she told him that she did not regret any of it, that she would do it again exactly the same way, but that the cost of it had been something she had only recently begun to understand. The cost was that you had to become your own fortress, he said. She looked at him. Yes, she said, that is exactly it. I understand that, he said, not as sympathy. As recognition. What was yours, she said, your fortress. He was quiet for a moment. Competence, he said. If you are good enough at things, if you are useful enough, efficient enough, then you never have to ask for what you actually need because you can provide it yourself. He paused. The problem with that approach is that it is very effective at achieving isolation. Yes, she said again. They sat with that for a moment, the shared recognition of two people who had each solved the problem of vulnerability in the same wrong direction. I notice, she said carefully, that you have been providing things for me without my asking. I have, he said. That is different from being asked. It is, he looked at her steadily, but you notice, you always notice, and you have not told me to stop. No, she said. I have not. The spring deepened and he came more often, sometimes not just on Fridays, and she began to notice the shape that her days made with and without him in them, the specific quality of the Friday morning light in the office versus the Tuesday morning light, which was identical but felt different in a way she stopped trying to argue with. He rode out to a homestead 20 miles north one Thursday morning to look after a family whose youngest had developed a serious fever, because there was still no doctor formally established in the county, and his medical knowledge was still the best available. And he was gone for 4 days, and she did not hear from him, and she went about her work with her usual efficiency, and felt his absence like a low note that persisted under everything. When he came back on the 4th evening, he came directly to the office instead of going to the ranch. The child had survived. He looked tired in a way she recognized, the specific exhaustion that came not from physical effort but from the sustained vigilance of being responsible for another person's survival. She got up from her desk without thinking about it and went to the stove and made coffee and brought it to him, and he looked at the cup, and then at her with an expression she had not seen before, startled and soft. She realized what she had done. She had brought him something. She had seen that he needed it and she had moved to provide it, not as a performance, not as a transaction, just as a simple human reflex. She was startled by herself. He wrapped his hands around the cup and she could see the tension in his shoulders drop by a degree, just 1 degree, and she thought, there it is. There is what he has been doing for me, all these months, all these small, careful offerings. There is what it looks like when someone receives it. She sat down across from him and they drank coffee in the quiet office, and she thought about what it meant that she had done that, moved toward him instead of away, answered his presence with her own presence, and she thought that perhaps the walls she had built were not coming down after all. Perhaps what was happening was something different. Perhaps she was learning to have a door. In May, he asked her to ride out to see the mesa in the morning light, because he had heard her mention once that she had never been up to the mesa at sunrise, and he had stored that piece of information somewhere careful and had not let it go. She went. They rode out in the hour before dawn on horses that knew each other's habits by now, up the trail that switched back and forth along the red rock face in the thin gray dark. And they reached the top as the sun split the eastern horizon, and the light came across the desert below them in a wave, turning everything from gray to gold in the space of a breath. Beatrice stood at the edge of the mesa and looked at Dust Creek below, small and brown and ordinary, the thing she had protected and served and fought for and been defined by for 6 years. And for the first time it looked from the outside the way she felt about it from the inside, which was that it was a real place, imperfect and difficult and genuinely hers. Simon stood beside her, not too close. At the distance that he always maintained, the careful, respectful distance that she had come to read as the opposite of what distance usually signified. Other men stood far from her as a rejection. He stood at a considered distance as an offering, a space she could choose to cross or not. She crossed it. She stepped closer just enough, and his arm came around her shoulders with the same unhurried inevitability of everything else he did, and she felt the solid warmth of him against her side and the sun coming up over the desert below, and she thought, "I am not afraid." She was surprised by that. She had expected fear, had been braced for it, had prepared all her usual responses. But what she felt instead was something she could only describe as arrival, the specific sensation of reaching a place you did not know you were traveling toward until you were standing in it. They stood like that for a long time. When they rode back down, the day was properly morning, and the dust was rising from the cattle pens, and somewhere in town someone was already hammering at something, and she felt the ordinary familiar pull of her work and her responsibilities, and she felt that it was not incompatible with this, that the two things could exist together. She was 34 years old, and she was learning again that the world could hold more than one thing at once. He kissed her the first time on a Friday in June, standing outside the office door after a morning that had gone long and rambling, and had included an argument about the appropriate response to the Cattlemen's Association proposal to extend grazing rights onto territory that bordered the Mescalero Apache Reservation, an argument in which they had disagreed substantially, and both had been, to their mutual satisfaction, exactly right about different halves of the problem. He had said something at the end of the argument that made her turn and look at him with recognition, the way she sometimes looked at the desert when a storm was coming, and it was beautiful and dangerous at once, and he had seen that look, and the next moment the distance between them was not a careful distance anymore. It was brief, the first time. Not tentative, exactly, but precise in the way of a first statement of a thing that had much more to say. His hand was against the side of her face, and she had her hand on the front of his coat, and the June heat was enormous, and the main street of Dust Creek was 2 feet away, and neither of them cared. "I have been wanting to do that since October," he said. "I know," she said. "You knew." "I noticed things too," she said. "The summer was the best of it, in the sense that it was new and it was theirs, and nothing terrible happened for a while, which in Dust Creek in 1879 was remarkable." She went to the ranch on Sunday afternoons and helped Consuela, the ranch cook who had sent the food in November, and who seemed to regard herself as personally responsible for the success of this arrangement. And she ate well and rode and talked and sat on the porch in the evenings watching the sun go down over the mesa. She was not good at being cared for. She was honest about that. She accepted things and then often forgot to accept them, fell back into her old patterns of refusing help and managing alone, and Simon recognized this without making a drama of it. When she backslid, he simply continued the quiet, steady pattern of showing up, not performing injury, not demanding acknowledgement, just being reliably there until she found her way back to the door. She was learning. She was learning that accepting care was not the same as surrendering to it, that letting someone feed you or bind your wound or sit with you when you were tired was not a defeat, that the walls she had built were not, in fact, what had kept her strong. She had been strong in spite of them. She could be strong with a door in them. She told him that one Sunday evening on the porch in approximately those words. He was quiet for a moment, the way he was quiet when he was receiving something that mattered. "That is the most you have said about yourself all at once," he said. "Yes," she said. "It is." He took her hand. His hands were large and careful, the hands of a man who had spent years doing precise and important work, and he held hers with the same quality of attention he gave everything. "I should tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "My partner in Amarillo," he said. "The gambling debt. I stayed with the practice longer than I should have because I believed that if I was competent enough and worked hard enough I could fix the situation. I worked myself nearly into the ground before the bank took everything. And when it was over I was not only broke, I was ashamed because I had let the circumstances dictate my life instead of choosing to do something about them sooner. That is not a moral failure," she said. "That is human nature." "I know that now," he said. "But I carried it as though it were. It is why I came out here. I needed to be somewhere that I had not already failed, where the slate was empty." "And instead you found me," she said. "And instead I found you," he said, "which was not what I was looking for, which turned out to be entirely the point." She leaned into him. She did it deliberately, made the choice clearly, let herself rest her head against his shoulder on the Sunday evening porch, and his arm came around her, and she felt the particular quality of that feeling again, the arrival. "We are both people who did it wrong for a long time," she said. "Yes," he said. "I think that is probably why we recognize each other." In September, a letter arrived from Ohio. Simon's mother, who he had not seen in 7 years, and with whom he corresponded irregularly and somewhat guiltily, had written to inform him that his brother had died of typhoid, and his mother was now alone on the family property outside Cleveland, and was 71 years old, and wondering whether her son might consider coming home. He showed Beatrice the letter. He did not tell her what he planned to do about it. He gave it to her as information, not as a question, and she read it and looked at him and understood that this was a moment she had been building toward without knowing it, that this was the test of the door she had installed in her walls. "What do you want to do?" she said. "I want to bring her here," he said. "If that is possible, if there is any reason to think that Dusk Creek could be home." She looked at him for a long time. "That depends on whether you intend to stay," she said. "I intend to stay," he said. "If you want me to stay." "I want you to stay," said Beatrice Rhodes. And she said it plainly, without hedging, without the careful qualifications she usually applied to everything she admitted, just stated it as fact the way he stated facts, directly and without apology. He let out a breath that was quiet and long, a breath that told her he had been holding something he had not been certain of, and she was moved by that, by the evidence that underneath his steadiness he had been uncertain, that he had been afraid too, that they had both been standing at the same door from opposite sides. He wrote to his mother that evening. He told her he was in New Mexico territory, and he had reasons to remain, and he would like very much for her to come south before the winter set in. He also, on a separate piece of paper, wrote something else, which he folded and held and did not give to her until the following Friday, when he came to the office in the morning and sat across the desk and put it on the surface between them without a word. She opened it. It said, in his precise handwriting, "I am asking you plainly because I believe you prefer plainness. I would like to marry you. I am not asking because you need someone to take care of you. You are abundantly capable of taking care of yourself. I am asking because I want to stand beside you and because I believe that the two of us together are better than either of us alone, not in spite of the ways we are difficult, but because of them. If you would rather I never ask again, I will not. If you would like time, take all the time you require. I am not going anywhere." She read it twice. She folded it. She looked up at him across the desk. "Yes," she said. He blinked. "Yes. Did you expect me to deliberate longer?" "Honestly, yes." "I have been deliberating for 8 months," she said. "I just did it privately, which is my preferred method." She looked down at the folded paper in her hands and then back up at him. "Yes. I will marry you. Those are my terms." For the first time since she had known him, A full smile broke across Simon Trask's face, not the small private thing at the corner of his mouth, but an actual, unguarded smile. And it was such a transforming thing on a face she had come to know so well that she felt it in her chest like a bell struck. "Those terms are acceptable," he said. They were married in November, a year and 1 week after he had first walked through her office door with her bullet wound and his leather bag. The ceremony was performed by a traveling minister in the Dusk Creek Town Hall and attended by most of the town, including Consuela from the ranch, who wept openly and without embarrassment, and Hartwell, the council chairman, who shook Simon's hand for so long that Simon had to eventually extract himself, and the bartender from the Red Horse, who came in his best shirt and stood in the back and looked profoundly moved. Simon's mother, Edith Trask, had arrived in October. She was a small, direct woman of 71 who had navigated the train journey from Cleveland to Albuquerque, and the stagecoach from Albuquerque to Dusk Creek with the composure of someone for whom this was merely the most recent logistical problem in a long life of logistical problems. And she had looked at Beatrice on the day. She arrived with a long, evaluating look that reminded Beatrice powerfully of the way Simon looked at things. That quality of wanting to see accurately. "My son says you are the sheriff," she said. "I am," said Beatrice. "Good," said Edith Trask, and that was that. She moved into a room at the ranch house and immediately reorganized the kitchen to her specifications and began growing things in a small plot she established behind the main building. And she and Consuela reached an understanding within a week that appeared to involve a division of territory and a great deal of coffee, and seemed to satisfy both of them entirely. After the wedding, Beatrice did not give up the badge. This had been a question in her mind, whether marrying would change the calculus, whether the town would expect her to step back now that she was a wife, whether Simon would expect it. She had intended to address it directly, but he had addressed it first the week before the wedding by saying simply, "You are the sheriff. That does not change because your name does." "My name is not changing," she said. "Beatrice Rhodes or Beatrice Trask, the badge stays put," he said. "That was my point." She kept the name Rhodes professionally. In private, between them, she tried both and found that she liked the sound of the other and used it there, in the space of their home, which was the ranch house on the Callaway spread where she now spent her evenings, even though she still rode into Dusk Creek every morning to open the office. Home. She had to practice the word a few times before it sat right in her mouth, before it felt like hers. But it did eventually. It settled into her with the slow sureness of things that are true. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was hard in the way that New Mexico winters could be hard, cold and dry, and full of the specific difficulties of isolated communities in bad weather. And Beatrice dealt with 3 property disputes, a missing cattle herd, and a violent altercation at the saloon that left 2 men with broken bones, and one with a moderate understanding of the consequences of his choices. Simon dealt with a range of medical cases that kept him busy and which he handled with his usual competence and his usual refusal to talk about how exhausted he was until she noticed and pointed it out. "You are as bad as I am," she said one evening, when she had caught him eating supper standing up at the kitchen counter because he had been too tired to sit down properly. "I know," he said. "Sit down and eat," she said. He sat. He looked at her with the expression she had come to love most, the one that was equal parts warmth and attention, and something that she thought was probably the same feeling she had, the arrival feeling, the sense of being exactly where you are supposed to be. "You told me to sit down," he said. "Yes." "You told me to do something because you noticed I needed it." "Yes," she said, understanding what he was saying. She sat across from him. "I suppose I did. 6 months ago you would not have done that. 6 months ago I was still learning that the door worked in both directions," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, just briefly, just for a moment, and then they both ate supper and talked about the missing cattle and the property disputes, and whether it was going to snow again before spring, And it was ordinary, and it was real, and it was, Beatrice thought, the best thing she had been given since before the Wednesday in October 7 years ago. Spring again, and a discovery that changed the shape of things in the most fundamental way. She was 35 years old, and she was precise about her own body, the way she was precise about everything. And so she knew before she had said a word about it to anyone, before she had even confirmed it with Simon, who had the relevant medical knowledge, but who she wanted to tell as a husband before she told as a doctor. She told him on a Sunday morning on the porch, with the April light coming across the mesa and the wildflowers already beginning along the base of the red rock. "I am pregnant," she said. She said it the same way she said everything important to him, directly, without preamble, looking him in the eye. He went very still. Then he looked at her with an expression so unguarded and so luminous that she had to look away from it for a moment, not because it was too much, but because it was such a complete stripping away of the quiet professional composure she was so accustomed to, showing her something underneath that she had not seen at full brightness before. "Beatrice," he said. His voice was not quite steady. "I know," she said. He crossed the porch and folded her carefully into his arms, the way he did things that required precision and also something more than precision, and she put her face against his chest and felt his heart beating fast under her cheek, and they stood like that in the April morning with the mesa turning gold above them. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am very well," she said. "I am better than I have been in a long time." A pause. "I am going to keep the badge." His chest moved with a quiet sound that was definitely a laugh. "I know you are," he said. She did keep the badge. She kept it through the spring and into the summer, adapting her work as necessary but refusing to treat her condition as an impediment, which it was not, practically speaking, for the better part of 7 months. Edith Trask watched her future daughter-in-law continue to ride into Dusk Creek every day and manage the law of the county, and said nothing except, one afternoon, "You remind me of myself at your age. I found it very useful." Beatrice looked at her. "Useful." "Being difficult," said Edith with perfect serenity. "It gets a great deal more done than being agreeable." She liked Simon's mother very much. In October, a son was born. They named him Thomas James Trask. Thomas for the man Beatrice had lost, and James for Simon's brother. And he arrived into the world with a full head of dark hair, and the specific imperious quality of a person who is surprised and displeased to find themselves in a new situation. Beatrice lay in the bed where she had delivered him, with Simon sitting beside her and their son in her arms, and she looked at the baby with the precise, evaluating attention she gave to everything, and she thought of the woman she had been 3 years ago, sitting in the dark office with a bullet wound she had refused to let anyone near. She thought of how close she had come to sending him away. She thought of how quiet it had been, the whole of it. Not the dramatic rescue, not the grand declaration, not the thing that announced itself. Just a man arriving, again and again, with food and tinctures and attention and his particular quality of showing up, until one day she had looked up and realized the fortress had a door, and she had been the one to install it. She had not let anyone take care of her in years until he did it so quietly she almost missed it. Almost. "Hello, Thomas James," she said to the baby. Her voice was steady and certain, and there was no distance in it at all. Simon leaned over and looked at his son with the expression she had come to know as his most unguarded, the full brightness of him, and said something very quiet that she did not entirely hear and did not need to, because she understood its shape from the quality of his voice. "He has your eyes," Simon said. "He has your nose," she said. "Poor child," said Simon. She laughed, the genuine and unguarded laugh that he had discovered in her the night of the election. And he heard it with the same startled warmth he always heard it with, even now, even 2 years in, as though it were still a gift that surprised him. The years folded out from there the way good years do, not without difficulty, not without the ordinary friction of real life and real work, but with a through line of warmth and steadiness that had not existed before, and that Beatrice came to understand, was the specific quality of a life shared with the right person. She won the election again in 1881 by a wider margin. Gerald Ashe retired from his banking interests under a cloud of circumstances that she was not directly responsible for but had not had a hand in, and the new bank was run by a woman from Santa Fe named Clara Reyes, who was brisk and fair, and immediately became one of Beatrice's most reliable informants, not for money, but out of a shared appreciation for things running properly. Simon formally established a medical practice in Dusk Creek in the spring of 1882, in the small building adjacent to the general store that the town council had been persuaded to allocate. He kept his work with the ranch because he genuinely liked the cattle and the open land, but the practice gave him back something he had not fully realized he had been missing: the daily engagement with medicine that had been his before the Amarillo disaster, the meaningful work of his specific training. He was, Beatrice observed, happier than she had ever known him. There was still the quietness, the careful steadiness, the dry quality of his humor that barely announced itself. But there was more of the full brightness now, more of the unguarded moments, as though proximity to happiness had loosened something that long isolation had held tight. She told him that, one evening. "I was thinking the same thing about you," he said. She was about to object, to point out that she had always been fine, that she had always been managing perfectly well, and then she stopped and looked at him and recognized what she was doing, the old habit, the reflex that said, "I do not need help, I am not changed by being known, I was already everything I am without you." It was not true, it had not been true for a long time. "Yes," she said instead, "I suppose I am different than I was." "Better," he said, not as a compliment, as a factual statement. "Better," she agreed. In 1883, their second child arrived, a daughter they named me Edith, for Simon's mother, who was still very much present and who received the news with the exact equanimity that suggested she had been expecting it and was pleased, but was not going to make a production of the fact. Me came into the world with lungs of considerable capacity and a loud and immediate opinion about everything, which Thomas, at 3 years old, found fascinating and slightly alarming. Edith Trask was 80 years old in 1892, and she died in her room at the ranch house on a clear October morning with the mesa visible through the window, and she went with the same composed practicality she had lived with, which seemed entirely appropriate. Beatrice was there, had been there through the last days, and she held the old woman's hand and thought of all the ways that arrival can look, the different shapes that belonging can take, and she was grateful. Simon grieved quietly, as she had expected, with the particular internality of a man who did not perform his feelings, and she recognized it and did not try to pull it out of him or change its shape, just stayed close, the way he had stayed close to her, and let him know that the door was there. He found his way through it in a few months, as people do, and came out the other side with something that was not quite acceptance and not quite peace, but was somewhere between them, the way most real things are somewhere between things. Thomas was 10 and me was 7, and the ranch was full, and the office in Dusk Creek was still hers, and the badge still caught the morning light the way it had the day she had taken it off her husband's chest and pinned it to her own. She had not made the same mistakes twice. She had not closed the door after she had learned to open it. She had learned instead to live in the daily practice of it, the small and unglamorous work of letting another person matter to you, of noticing when they needed the coffee and bringing it, of saying the things that were hard to say because the alternative was a fortress, and you already knew what it was like to live in one. She had not let anyone take care of her in years until he had done it so quietly she almost missed it. She had not missed it. That was the whole of the story in the end, which was not an end but a long middle, the best kind. A woman who had been her own fortress learning, slowly and without fanfare, to have a door. A man who had come looking for a blank slate and found instead something worth staying for. A town that kept on being difficult and real and needing her attention. A family that had grown around both of them, the way things grow in the desert, stubbornly and beautifully, and against all reasonable expectation. On a Friday in the spring of 1884, Beatrice Rhodes rode into Dust Creek in the early morning with the light gold and low, and the birds singing somewhere up along the mesa. And she opened the office and made coffee and sat at her desk. And at approximately 7:30, she looked toward the window. Simon Trask rode up the main street on the bay horse he had kept for 5 years and tied it at the post outside her office, and came through the door with his hat in his hands, the same as the first time, and he looked at her across the desk with the quiet and attentive expression that was still, even after years, the thing she loved most about his face. "Good morning, Sheriff," he said. "Good morning," said Beatrice Rhodes, and she handed him the second cup of coffee she had already poured because she had known he was coming, had known it the same way she knew everything, from the careful accumulation of evidence, and she was not afraid of knowing it any more. He took the cup. He sat down. He looked out the window at the waking town. She picked up her work. Outside, the desert turned from gold to white in the climbing morning sun, and Dust Creek went about its loud, difficult, ordinary life, and the office was quiet, and everything in it was exactly where it was supposed to be.